Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Tarker, and I'm doing this presentation for a research class. And this is an idea map for the lit review I'm planning to do. And I might do two of these. Because I know we still have another week before this is actually due, so I might actually post a second one. Because I'm kind of at a crossroads in my dissertation where I'm thinking about doing two different dissertation topics. All both and but both of them are linked. They're not wildly divergent in that they're both going to be looking at leadership, along the transformational to transactional spectrum. However, what they look at in terms of that might be different. And this particular mind map or idea map is really looking at crisis management. I was kind of intrigued by when Rita came to speak to us about the shooting in Umpqua and the invitation to write about that incident. Kind of intrigued me because I think it's a really compelling story. There's a lot of relevance to it, and crisis management is something that all organizations have to deal with. And I was curious. Well, is there a link between transformational or transactional leadership and crisis management? And as I started digging a little bit into the research on this topic, and once again, I've only really with transactional versus transactional, I felt like I've read quite a bit. I haven't exhausted it, but read quite a bit, so I'm fairly comfortable with it. Oh, within crisis management, I'm just kind of starting to scratch the surface. And I think this mind map reflects that. So, so some things I want to point out. Unfortunately, with this program, I can't zoom in. Uh, so bear that in mind. In any event, in the center here we have the crisis, which is kind of, I think, appropriately at the center. And then notice that framing the crisis, because we have the cause of the crisis up here, but framing it is a conversation around leadership. We have transformational over here and transactional on this side. And as far as the cause of the crisis, it could be anything, and it could be related to the leadership or not. So I tried to keep it disconnected from the conversations around leadership as far as the cause, although there could be a linkage, right? Especially if you get down here to some of the different types, the employee-related crises could definitely be caused by leadership, as just one example. So to get a transformational, we have the different transformational leadership behaviors, and I think it's important to emphasize that we're really talking in terms of leadership around behavior. And so we have the different behaviors: intellectual stimulation, making sure that your employees are ideas, and minds are stimulated. Individualized attention, making sure you treat everybody like an individual and attend to them in such a way. Um, Inspirational motivation is also important, to inspire people to think about the core values of the mission of the organization and things of that nature. And then idealized influence, right? And once again, that is speaking to uh, putting the values and the mission of the organization above your own needs, and letting your employees see that. Then there's transactional, and this is really based on the contingent rewards behavior. Where it's you get punishment and rewards depending on your performance. And that's contingent rewards, and some people respond to that. So it's one thing. It's important to keep in mind that neither one of these are exclusively better than the other. Ideally, some research shows that most effective leaders have a little bit of both. They're a little bit transformational, and they're a little bit transactional when they need to be, and it's contextualized. So contingent rewards is part of it. Um, Management by exception. There's both of it. So management by exception, meaning that you're only focusing on when somebody does something wrong before you take a corrective measure. Um, Active means that you're always actively looking at your employees in that manner. So you're always just looking for them to make mistakes so you can correct them. Passive management by exception is when you're not actively looking for it, but you're passive in your relationship with the employee until they make a mistake and then you correct them. And then there's just laissez-faire where you're not really engaged at all. You're not actively doing anything and not being accountable either. And those are some of the behaviors within the spectrum of transactional leadership. So from there, and I think these leadership styles just kind of frame the overall organizational zeitgeist and atmosphere. So then we have the cause of the crisis, which brings us to things like signal detection. Some people might perceive that that there's a potential for something to go awry. There's a potential for crisis, and part of that is those people who do perceive that can have an influence and help with preparing for the crisis that might be impending and might affect the company or organization or school. Um, because they're making sense of the world around them, so that there's a part of that goes into it. And then they have a perspective about what's going on as well within the organization, and they're able to perceive certain things. And then they have to, sell that idea. They have to sell their idea that something's wrong to address it, right? And that really comes down to speaking to the leadership. And some research shows that the perceptions of the leaders especially the executive team of the organization, really do have an influence on preparedness. If leaders don't perceive that there's a need for preparation or a threat, then they're not going to do that. And that's kind of tied to here, where it's not a typical mindset of an executive in a business or organizational situation to think in those terms. They're thinking about growth, they're thinking about more of the positive aspects, not the dangers typically. And so that's why I kind of had these intersect with the crisis line, because that the leader's perception has a big influence on whether whatever's going on up here gets to the crisis mode. And then, within that, if the leader does have a perception of it, there can be organizational planning, a crisis management team, risk management person or people, drills, practices, and organizational flexibility and creativity can all feed into all of that. But in any event, we live in a crisis culture. I mean, a world full of crises, and even with preparedness, crises are bound to happen. And there are different types of crises that are defined that the literature defines. There are accidents, like the Ducks accident at North Seattle College. Who could have prepared for that? Although we're finding, definitely, and I won't go into that, but we are finding that there are things that could have been done to help make that situation better, right? So, when people got on the bus, there was no list of people who were actually on the bus or permission slips or anything like that, so that when the accident happened, the school really didn't know who was on the bus or where they went. So if there had even been just a list of people who attended that event, that would have mitigated a lot of things, and they're actually addressing that now. Employee-centered things like strikes, scandals are another thing, but employee-centered crises, project and safety and health, scandals, and then I've added myself violence and terrorism, because I think those are a different kind of crises that don't really fit into these other four categories to me. And I think this is a whole different category, and the shooting in Umpqua would fit into that, because it was both active violence and one could say terror, right? And then we also have definitions. So within a crisis, it's defined as something that's ambiguous, which means it can be seen in two different ways, or maybe even more, by the public and by internal stakeholders and by the people involved. There's multiple ways to view it. Um, Also, that it's an immediate threat to the organization. It's something serious and immediate and threatening. to the well-being of the organization and the people involved. And then it's not containable. It's important to remember that, yeah, by being not, it's not containable on many different levels. And the a lot of the literature talks about how, as a global society, most things aren't containable anymore. Most crises, and because we're so interconnected, you know, foot and mouth disease might appear in some cattle in Europe, you know, in Italy, in Ireland, or something like that, and then a couple of days later, it's being found in the United States. I mean, in a matter of days. So the idea of containment is uh, you know, not really even relevant in some cases in the 21st century because we are so globally connected. So we have the crisis, and then, of course, once the crisis happens, we go into damage control. A lot of that centers around communication. Well, before we get to that, you know, damage control is really about, you know, the leadership being able to make decisions um, in a crisis situation where you know, and there's a lot of factors that go into that: fatigue, making decisions under pressure, not having all the information, things like that. And that sometimes forces leaders to go into a very conservative mindset when they're making decisions, whereas in some cases, taking risks, even within a crisis situation, can be more beneficial at times than just uh, being conservative. And of course, communication is a huge part of this as well. And communicating to external and internal stakeholders. An important thing to always think about is the perceptions and assumptions of both the internal and external stakeholders. There's lots of assumptions and about what leadership can do in certain situations and what they should do versus what they can do, and those are important to be aware of as well. And then also, you know, communication to the media. You know, the media is out for a story, as we heard with the Umpqua speech, and I definitely experienced that when we had the Ducks tragedy at North Seattle. You know, the media were crawling all over the place, and they weren't necessarily interested in accurately reflecting the information. They were definitely more interested in telling the story that they wanted to tell. Um, so there's all that, the whole communication factor. And then that leads to this idea of recovery down here. And I'm trying to move some stuff around, but we have recovery. And then and recovery really deals with making sure the organization frames that they are resilient, you know, and really communicating that. And then acting with integrity is also really important as well, and to get the public's trust again. And then we have learning, and that gets kind of cut off here. I'm sorry about that, but I will have this uploaded so you can look at this on your own. But going back, ultimately, you want to be a learning organization and learn from this event. And so there, you know, there should be reflection after you've addressed the crisis and recovered. There should be a time for reflection, and that should also feed back up here into crisis preparedness, right? What you learn and what we reflect on should inform future crises and responses as well. So that's kind of where I'm at with my idea map. Thank you for listening to this presentation, and I definitely find it's helping me organize my ideas and looking at what I more deeply at what aspects I need to look at in terms of the literature review, and really the relationships between all the different variables that would go into a dissertation like this one. So thank you very much. Have a good day.